it occurred to me just before coming into satsang that um, I always found that after going to India or being in a particular place for an extended period of time, and in India there was a lot of contemplating and new information in relation to how life can be seen, and it triggered or started a process each time, a new exploration of a new aspect of the teaching, or really just a new aspect of life where something would be revealed. And then a change of scenery, a change of routine, where I maybe returned back to my home country, would inspire a shift in how that information then moved deeper. So all this to say that next week I'll take some time off from doing the daily talks, which means a change in routine for you guys. And who knows, that week where things are a little different might prove to be as was the case for me when things changed a little. So there'll be today's talk and tomorrow's talk, and then the normal Sunday off, and we'll return the following Monday with 1 week of no talks. So for all of you who've turned up day after day for the last 3 months or so, and funnily enough, actually, it's been 3 months, almost to the day. So I only just realized that, and yet it seems quite fitting. So for those that turned up, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I suspect we'll be back in a week. I was asked to talk about Indra's net of jewels. And to be honest, Indra's net of jewels as a metaphor, as an explanation of the universe, has never played a particularly important role in how I came to see life in a changing way. So there isn't a personal resonance to that particular metaphor. However, what it does do, without me specifically talking about Indra's net, is lead me into a parallel explanation about seeing life differently to what it appears on the surface. So, in brief, Indra's net is a story that appears in some of the old Vedas, I think, where it's said that Indra had a net, an art piece crafted by a craftsman, and that art piece was a representation of the universe, and it was the equivalent of, let's say, a three-dimensional net or cobweb, spider's web, where at each joining point there was a jewel. So it's Indra's net of jewels, and from each point the net goes off into many directions. I'm guessing, let's say 8 or 10 different directions, and at each of the joins from one jewel there's another meeting point, and there's all these jewels, and it's a three-dimensional net. And an important point about these jewels and the net is that because the jewels are crystal clear, there is a infinite, and the net expands infinitely, so it has no edges, no beginning, no end, and within each jewel there is the reflection of all the other jewels, a bit like if you go into a changing room and there's 2 mirrors. you can set up the mirrors so that you have this infinite expansion of reflections. And in a way, there's this, in each of the jewels, there is a reflection of the entirety of Indra's net represented within each jewel. So it's very similar to the notion of a hologram, where in each part of the hologram, the whole is contained. So in a hologram, in theory, if it's a hologram of a person, let's say, if you go into one portion of light and zoom in, there is the whole image of the man or the woman or whatever the object is in every component or every molecule, every piece, every sub-component of the whole reflects the whole in it. So effectively, this is a metaphor for the infiniteness of life, the non-linearness of life, the commonality of life, meaning that when you go past the surface appearance and go down into the depth, we find that there is a commonality, and more importantly, that if one part of the whole is known, the whole is known. So all of this is essentially, hopefully, leading into a discussion of how life needs to be looked at differently. That seeing life as it presents is on the surface. If we remain with a tunnel vision and accept or assume that this is it, then what might be happening is that a depth to life might be being missed. And essentially, it's the equivalent of knowing life in a very shallow manner. And maybe if life is known in a shallow manner, then we know ourselves in a shallow manner. And if we know ourselves in a shallow manner, we don't really know ourselves. And in not knowing ourselves, there may be an inherent uncomfortableness. And in coming to see life differently, which means coming to appreciate aspects of life that we didn't realize were present, were part of life, then simultaneous to seeing life as a whole with more depth, we might really start to see ourself with more depth. And it might be a connection to the depth of our being, which is really just a way of coming to know ourselves on a deeper level, that may bring about the end of an uncomfortableness, which is the uncomfortableness I described of not knowing ourselves fully, not knowing life fully. Now, even this notion of knowing life fully can be misunderstood by the thinking mind, by the intellect, and it can come up with grand notions of what that will look like, what it will mean. And so keep in mind, a lot of these words are there to try and coax out a sense and a seeing of something differently, and they're not necessarily to be taken too literally. So I think it's fair to say that simply coming across the description that life is a happening and not my doing, that we are not actually separate, independent entities in life, and that what we're really looking for is a life where there is peace rather than a life where there is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That in itself can be quite a sort of unheard of or radical difference in the way that we tend to understand life. And yet, in a way, often as it's described still on the level of causality, that we are not the doer because whatever happens in each moment is a result of our makeup, a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is the biological and psychological aspect of the human being, find themselves amongst life at each moment, which means in a petri dish, effectively, and there is an interaction and a reaction all the time with the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the life situation we find ourselves in. And those interactions, those reactions are impersonal, really. They're not controlled by a doer, by a controller. They are happening just like if two chemicals come in contact with each other, they have their own composition, and the two chemicals come into contact with each other, and there's a reaction that is completely determined by the composition of the chemicals. The chemicals don't have some controller or doer aspect to themselves that decides, okay, this is how I'm going to react. The reaction happens, and human beings really are very complex chemicals, you could say. In the metaphor, we are like a very complex chemical in an environment, and the chemical reacts with other aspects of the environment, and the human being reacts to other aspects of the environment, be it just the physical aspects of the environment, or the physical aspects of the environment as they are presented through the form of another human being. And so that is explained to be life happening, and the thoughts are an output of this very complex biological instrument, the feelings of hunger, of tiredness, of different biological feelings, are outputs of the biological entity. So thoughts, feelings, emotions, words, actions are all outputs. And the instrument is an output of life. So where is this me? Where does the me fit in? What we'll find is the me is an output. It is a product of the instrument, and the instrument is a output, a product of life. And the me, which is an output, thinks it is the entity that produces all the outputs. What a joke, but that's how it is. And so just contemplating this and seeing, where is the me? What is the me? When we see there is no space for a doer, there is only life happening according to impersonal design. And so that's a radically different way of understanding the human being, understanding the nature of life. But it still implies a fair degree of causality. It still explains how life is different on a causal level. And the doership identity, the me thoughts that are continually arising moment after moment, which is why it feels like that doership identity is an actual entity rather than a continually changing set of attitudes to life, which are really thoughts and thoughts in their deeply concentrated form are what you could call psychological feelings. Because they're continuously happening, the judging of life, so the observing of it and then the judging of it as to what it means about me, given that the me has an idea of itself as the one that made these things happen, has an idea of the other as the one that makes these things happen, and importantly believes that it requires life to turn out a certain way in order for there to be a completeness of the human being. And so that really means that life needs to turn out a certain way. It's a matter of life and death for the idea of this me, which is why there is so much resistance against life turning out in a way that is not in line with expectation, and so much craving for life to turn out according to expectation, because to this psychological me, that means life or death. And so in the Buddha's words, enlightenment is the end of suffering, and the cause of suffering is attachment. It's pretty simple. It's made very simple. Now, what is attachment? Attachment is when attachment is there, what arises is desire. So in between that sandwich of life is suffering, and we're told enlightenment is the end of suffering. So enlightenment is the end of suffering, and the cause of suffering is attachment, essentially attachment to outcomes. And when there is attachment to outcomes, which is really part of the psychological identity, what arises is desire, craving for those outcomes. And that's what drives us in the outward direction. That's what drives us in this manner that where we are hypnotized into thinking the purpose of life is to travel into the future, where in the future our desires may be met, meaning our pleasures, that which we believe will complete us, might one day be satisfied. And so we're off trying to make that happen. And it makes sense that if that's an inherent part of our makeup, part of the psychological me, which is actually just an output of the body, which is an output of life. So the psychological me is completely off track. It's completely ignorant about the nature of life and the nature of itself. So it is an output, a thought output. However, it is a thought output that says, I am the creator of all the outputs. And I need this in order to be complete. I need this in the future, pleasure, in order to be complete. So if that's the psychological identity, it makes sense that whenever anyone looks at it in a certain way, well, looks at the body and then the thought arises that the thought is spat out, and the thought says, hey, I am that which you are looking at in that way that is painful to me, and that is an attack on who I am. And so when that happens, the look of the other is taken as a personal attack, and it creates this uncomfortableness. And so it makes sense that that happens, because the psychological me has this inherent in it, this idea that life needs to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order for it to one day be complete, for this uncomfortable feeling to go away. And ironically, the uncomfortable feeling is because of this thought. And then the thought says this uncomfortable feeling is because I don't have pleasure. Whereas actually, if that thought dissolved, the stop taking life personally. And I'm not saying stop to some entity. I'm saying if in an instant the system stops outputting that thought, it dissolves and it doesn't replace it with the continuation of the narrative. There's a stopping. The uncomfortableness stops. That's when we start to realize, the uncomfortableness is not because we don't have the pleasures that that thought thinks it needs, but rather because that thought exists, the thought that thinks it needs pleasures. So when we start seeing this, seeing that the uncomfortableness is not because we are lacking anything, the uncomfortableness is because of a presence of this psychological me, that's when the movement outwards stops, and a movement whereby energy is not continually fed into producing that output happens. And so, because there's no one doing that, it's not something you have to make happen. It's something that life makes happen by reconditioning the instrument which produces or doesn't produce that psychological me output. And why does life do it? Life does it because the instrument, the body-mind organism, is an output of life. So it's only life that can change its outputs. And it's then the body, which essentially is a form of life, that changes the outputs, which is the psychological me. So all of that is still describing it according to causality. And causality is not an invalid or erroneous or an illusory or an ignorant way of seeing life. It isn't. Causality does exist as one side of the coin of life. It's just that when we know one side of the coin only, we don't know the other side of the coin. And knowing one side of the coin and believing it to be absolute can prevent us from realizing there's another side of the coin. And so teachings will sometimes come and say, that side of the coin, it's not the truth. And it's true, it's not the truth, because the truth is the whole coin, which has both sides. And so it is a valid teaching methodology to say, no, that is not correct. That is all ignorance. Simply to bring attention to see the other side. Now, I would say that the real ignorance is not causality per se, but causality that includes a personal doer as the source of part of the causality of life. So if the personal doer idea dissolves out of causality, then there is no problem with causality. In order for that personal doer idea to dissolve, sometimes it's necessary to undermine the validity of causality per se for a while. Simply because the doer is so intertwined with seeing life in a linear fashion, in a causal fashion, that it's too hard to extract just the doership, the bond between them. It's like roots have penetrated into the causality, and to extract the two just isn't going to happen because they've become bonded. And so it's a bit like chemotherapy in a way, is that you have to bombard the good cells because the dangerous cells have become mixed in with them. And then once the good and the bad cells have been bombarded, then it's understood that there will be a process of the good cells eventually, hopefully, regenerating. And so if we take away causality as a valid way of seeing life, what that can do is take away the doership idea, the doership psychological me, that is in itself always based on time and causality, and you did this that led to this, and this means this about me. And so all of the suffering, all of the worry assumes a past and a future, and then adds in the doership, me as a doer and the other as the doer, and then looks at the future and worries about the future, because when that doership is there, the sense that I need outcomes to be complete is also so heavily intertwined. So that's why often we're told that seeing life as duality, seeing life as form, seeing life as causality, seeing life as time-bound is ignorance. And then it's replaced by a different explanation of life. And the explanation of life is spontaneity, non-causality, non-linear, non-time-bound, not even based on a framework of space. So infinite means the absence of space. Eternal means the absence of time. Non-causal means not A leading to B leading to C leading to D, which would require time and space for the objects to move and create the domino effect. So once all of that view of life is deemed to be ignorance, a replacement which says life is a spontaneous happening, that there is no causality, that when you turn on the light switch and a millisecond later the light goes on, which implies a movement of causality from the switch going on, electricity moving through the electrical wire and then powering up the light element and creating light, which then travels through space. So all of that implies causality, and we're told that's not how life actually is. That each moment is a spontaneous creation, independent from the last as far as causality goes, and paradoxically not separate from any other moment. So in this teaching, it's sometimes said to include this side of life, although the predominant is to focus on the error of doership and attachment to outcome and describe it still causally. But because life is a paradox and life does have a dimension that is beyond form and beyond time and space, we sometimes in the teaching point to the quantum aspect of the human being, which is really pointing to the beingness, that when we rest in that dimension of ourself, there is a sense that there is no time and no space in that there are no specific personal characteristics which all exist on the surface level. And it's also described that infinite creative potentiality, source at rest, or the unmanifest, at some point, because its infinite creative potentiality explodes into manifestation and becomes the whole of the manifestation from beginning of time to the end of time as a block, as a predetermined story. And so the whole of time is created in an instant. Source at rest, consciousness at rest, the unmanifest, that means prior to the universe, prior to time and space, which is part of the fabric of the universe. So if we imagine the universe as a big balloon and we have it contracting down to a pinpoint, so all of time and all of space contracts down, which is the opposite of the theory of the Big Bang, which is this big expansion of time and space. So let's reverse it, put it into rewind, and down, 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 down to a pinhead and then even the pinhead, much, much smaller than a pinhead, an atom and a subatomic particle, and then nothing, even that is gone. And that is the complete absence of time and space. And so that is the source in its potential form. Consciousness at rest, the unmanifest. And we can call that source infinite creative potentiality, as opposed to dead nothing. And because it's potentiality, it has to manifest at some point. And manifestation in this framework says it's the infinite potentiality actualizing. And in this universe, the one or this experience that we know, it actualizes into a universe of time and space and a universe of evolution, a story of humanity. And that story happened in an instant. All of time, from the beginning of time to the end of time, created in an instant. And from that point of view, we have A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D as the unfolding of time. However, D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A. Because the whole of time arose in an instant. It's a block. So causality goes in two ways. In order for the end of the story to be like it is, the beginning of the story needed to be specifically a certain way. So it's sort of like looking at it, if there's going to be two cars bump into each other at an intersection, you can say that's the outcome. And let's say that's D. So you can start off with D. Say D is the beginning. So if D is the beginning, we start with the outcome as the beginning, then we must put C in place and B in place and A in place in order for D to happen. So you can work backwards. And when it unfolds, we see it as A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. But it's just as valid to say D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A. And it's also valid and needs to be that A is independent of B, is independent of C, is independent of D. And it needs to be seen that A and B and C and D are not separate. Now all of that can sound like fantasy that is completely dislocated from anything that the human being can know. And it could even be said to just be in the realm of mystical spirituality. However, what can get us to think twice about this? So if I presented this to someone who's a relatively critical thinker in life, has given some thought to things, so who in theory will think quite well, if they listen to certain theories from spiritual teachings about God or whatever, they'll say, you know what, the likelihood is you're just believing that this is the case because someone has told you. And actually it's fantastical to believe this. And the truth is they're probably right a lot of the time. However, if we go to quantum physics theory and we look at what calculations and what observations are made on the quantum physics, in the quantum physics field, we find that what quantum physics sees is a life that is very much as described. And now, quantum physics doesn't really prove this in a way that would enable us to then say, life is like that. well, quantum physics might prove it, but to the one hearing it, it's not really a proof. It's a theory, and I trust, let's say, that the theory comes from someone having observed it and concluded it and worked off measurements and all of that. What can also happen is we can start to get a sense and an experience of life from this other perspective. And then from this experience of life that we can have for ourselves, when we hear about the mystics talking about the timeless and the formless and the non-causality, the interconnectedness of life, the non-linear existence of time and space, it can be something that we might not be able to say definitively is the truth, but there is an access to a dimension of the human being that we say, yes, all of those descriptions match the characteristics, the nature of this deeper dimension of the human being. And so then we also listen to what quantum physics says about the nature of life. And to our senses, it makes no sense. To our working mind that is based on knowing life through the senses and seeing life as causal and form-based, the explanations in quantum physics just don't make sense because they fly counter to the Newtonian physics rules. And so this can help us a lot to really understand that, science itself is presenting two pictures when life is observed from different angles, which isn't saying that science is in opposition. Quantum physics and mechanical physics are not in opposition with each other. They're not arguing which one is right. They're understanding that they coexist. That on the surface, the behavior of the macro world follows Newtonian physics rules, which are part of the cosmic rules. I mean, we've just called them Newtonian physics, but they existed long before Newton started to come up with his hypotheses and theories and calculations and observations. So that aspect of the universe has always, or the manifestation has always been there, and so has the deeper aspect of the universe, because the universe has always been the universe, which is as it is. And science is now appreciating that the whole is much more deep and paradoxical than what is available to us when we are stuck with a relationship to life that only sees the macro expression of life. And so it can be helpful to understand, if I only know the macro, I probably don't really know myself. I probably don't really know life. So that gives us a good internal reason, if this explanation can get us to see that, this notion that life is not quite as it appears on the surface, the notion that life is not some fantasy, but something that is very much confirmed by quantum physics. And in fact, there are many machines that operate on the basis of the quantum laws. So we have quantum computers that do calculations based on quantum law, not mechanical law. which means human beings have understood quantum laws sufficiently to harness it and create machines that are based on quantum understanding. So to give you an example of how mind-bending it can be to the intellect that is so convinced that life is the way that it sees things, there is the Schrodinger's cat experiment in quantum physics that puts an unfortunate cat into a box, and the box has a random computer mechanism in there that will either deliver a lethal dose to the cat or won't deliver a lethal dose to the cat. And the operator is not in control of knowing what dose has been delivered to the cat. And so the box is closed. And let's say the dose is delivered after a minute, and 3 minutes have elapsed. And so from our understanding of life, from a Newtonian surface experience of life, our thinking says the cat is either dead or alive, and it has been dead or alive for the 1 minute it was in the box before the dose was delivered or not delivered, and the 3 minutes after that. So it's either been alive for 4 minutes, or it was alive for 1 minute and dead for 3 minutes. That's a normal assumption based on our understanding of time and how form exists. The quantum physics explanation is that at a period after the dose is theoretically delivered or not delivered, the cat exists in both a dead and alive state simultaneously. So if our working mind tries to figure this out, it tries to figure out a cat in both states. And it doesn't know how to hold that, because the physical world says it's going to be, it can only be one thing. And so furthermore, the quantum physics explanation says the cat remains in a state of flux, existing in both its dead and alive state, until such time as the box is opened up and the cat is observed. And at the very moment of observation, the cat actualizes out of its potential state into its actualized state. And only in that moment is the cat dead or alive. And our working mind says, oh yeah, that's a theory, but actually the cat was dead or alive. Always in the time when the box was closed. And I'm fine, okay, but that's not what the explanation of reality is. Our working mind, our intellect says, yeah, sure, all of that, I don't understand it, so the cat was dead or alive. The observation on a quantum level says, no, the cat was not dead or alive. The cat existed in both forms. And these are observations and measurements and calculations of quantum law that enable immense amounts of energy to be measured, and the tiniest of particles to be observed, particles that can be observed going back millions of years. So it starts to demonstrate to us that time is not something that's past, but rather something that coexists. All of time exists in this moment. So when we hear that life is not as it seems. That might mean something much more radical than we give that statement credit for. It's becoming more and more accepted, even by lay people, that there is a very reasonable chance that this experience of life that we're having is actually a virtual creation created by a civilization, let's say humanity, that is not of this time. That this is just a simulation created by a humanity or a civilization that has technological capacity to create virtual worlds. Now, why is that becoming more and more acknowledged as a possibility? Simply because we see that within this creation there is technological advancement such that the civilization that may in fact be a civilization of a virtual world is able to create virtual worlds, which would mean a virtual world within a virtual world if, and I say if, this is a virtual world. And so as we see things available to us for us to understand, then certain notions that seem far-fetched become reasonable. We say, well, if I could put myself into a virtual world, or if I could subject myself to some technological entertainment that is rolled out in my lifetime, maybe in fact it's already, we put on these virtual worlds, so something similar to the movie Avatar. If we actually have the experience of being able to go into a virtual world ourselves and realize how quickly the human consciousness adapts and identifies with a digital world, then we have to start asking, well, maybe this is not as it seems. Now, mystics have been referring to life as a dream, as an appearance in consciousness, for thousands of years. Now, let me be clear, I'm not saying that this is a virtual world. But if it was a virtual world, it would be experienced more or less like all of us experience life as we know it. If it's the experience of an objective world, it would also be experienced the way that we experience life. So what we can come to out of that is an amazing point where we go, we can't know whether this is the experience of an objectively real world or the experience of a virtual world, because both of them would, in theory, be experienced the way we experience life as we know it. What it does mean is that we can't rule out the fact that life is not at all as it seems. Because if it's a virtual world, then it seems like it is a objective reality, but in fact it's essentially a dream. If it's the experience of an objective world, then still what we know of it is still an experience. It is not the real thing. It is our interpretation based on limited hardware. It is our image of the objective world, if in fact there is an objective world. So animals like bats have extra senses that can pick up aspects of the objective world, if it's an objective world, like electromagnetic pulses, let's say, or echo sound sensibilities that humans don't have generally developed. And so from the perspective of a different sentient entity, the experience of life is very different to what a human experiences life as. Because the human's intellect is, you could say, more complex in terms of the intellectual capacity to contemplate one's own existence, to form language, to communicate. And dogs have much more sensitive or can hear sound frequencies that humans can't. They have much more sensitive sense of smell. Dolphins can use this echolocation. So each human being and each species will know life as an experience of life, which really means an experience within the consciousness that knows the experience. So if there is an objective world, our experience of it is a subjective experience of the objective world. If there is no objective world and it's a virtual reality of one sort or the other, then it's a virtual reality which is a subjective experience inside consciousness that is aware of it, with no objective reality of the experience outside. So this can have you walking through the park in amazement, just being aware of space and wondering whether it's really space. Being aware of the tree and recognizing that the tree may not have a history, and that the tree that has an experience of being a very solid item or object may in fact be made of consciousness, the consciousness in which it arises. We know that the experience of it is only made of consciousness, designed to be experienced as if the tree is solid. So that is the experience of it, but really that experience exists within the conscious experience. So moving through life, wondering about where it all comes from, and whichever model we take, whether we see this as a virtual creation in the mind of God, and the question is, what is God? The safest thing is to say God in its manifest form is consciousness, because to know the experience there must be consciousness. Experience is inherently conscious. There must be awareness of the experience for there to be experience. And so in its manifest form, we can say God as a placeholder is consciousness. And it might be that the God of this world is not the God that the metaphysical God, but it could be whoever has created the virtual world. To the main character in this experience of life, we might as well say God equates to nothing, because the character can never know the creator. The character can know the creator as the creator manifests within this manifestation. And so if we go back to this net of jewels, we might find that if we know the core of ourself, we know the core of the whole universe. Without knowing the universe at a distance, but know that if I know the core of myself, I know what the core at any point is. So to the character in the dream, which is why it's so poetic to refer to God as absolute nothing, infinite creative potentiality, because the seeker or the human being that is asking about God can come to understand, as one's appreciation of life starts to deepen, you can say, as the ignorance that keeps us seeing life in a narrow, limited form starts to fall away, the character could realize that the created object, the created character, can never know the creator source, because that is outside of the creation. A bit like the dream character at night in the consciousness of someone sleeping. The dream character can never meet the source, which is the human sleeping in the bed, assuming that we take life to be an objective reality and the human being the source of the dream at night. If we take that perspective, the character in the night dream can never meet the dreamer, because the dreamer exists outside the realm of the dream character. So the dream character can't jump outside of the dream to meet the dreamer. If that happened, the dream character dissolves. And so in reverse, while the dream character is contemplating, I wonder what source is. Source relative to the dream character is absolute nothing. Because if the dream character jumps out of the dream, which it can't do, but if it did, it dissolves on the level of the creator. So relative to the creator, the character is absolute nothing. So if you reverse it round from the perspective of the character can say, God is absolute nothing. So any image that we have of God is an image created within the dream. And it may as well be replaced with an image, or if what I say is understood, there won't even be an image of absolute nothing. It will just be the absence of any image. Understanding that my relationship to God can be as if God is absolute nothing, and God has become absolute nothing, has turned into absolute everything. So the best that we can know God is to know the consciousness functioning through the human being. And then we can say that is the core of the human being, which means, following Indra's net, the core of the manifestation. And if that is the core of the manifestation, then we can say that is God in manifest form. And God in manifest form, the God we're talking about might be a person on a gurney in a entertainment complex. So we can't know God. And there's no problem with that. We don't need to know God. To know consciousness, and to know that consciousness is the God of my experience. If you take your experience and you extract turned off consciousness, the whole experience collapses. And in the collapsing of the experience, the sense of Roger, with any thoughts and words and memories, collapses. So I can say that consciousness is the source of Raja. Not necessarily separate from Raja, but I can say that the manifest expressions of Raja, the more gross aspects of Raja, come after the consciousness or simultaneous to the consciousness. And so we can have this sense as we rest into this deeper dimension of ourself that I am and awareness, which are two aspects of consciousness that we come to know ourselves as, that I am or awareness is the source of Raja. And when I'm talking about Raja, I'm talking about the personality, the characteristics, the words, the preferences, the movements. And it's so appropriate to say, the core of Raja is the source of Raja. Because the core of Raja is the source of the universe. Or the core of Raja is the core of the universe. And the core of the universe is God in manifestation. So if you're trying to become one with God, and you have some idea of becoming one with the Absolute, or what is referred to as the Absolute, maybe this description will say, that's a objective that is going to lead to frustration. Because the dream character and any thought that you might have about God is part of the dream character. It's all within the dream. Can never know or become one with God in its unmanifest form. We become one with God in its unmanifest form when the dream collapses back into its unmanifest, into the unmanifest. And so then, at some point I wondered, okay, why do I have this sense that I have a gratitude towards God? And I thought, does it maybe not make sense to have a feeling that comes up from time to time of feeling grateful? Like, who am I feeling grateful to? Or what entity am I feeling grateful to? Because in this description, I would say God doesn't have cognition or intention. So the way we can, as a framework, hold it is that source at rest, infinite creative potentiality, explodes into manifestation without even knowing what it is becoming. So it has no intention. It is just creativity turning into expression. And so it doesn't need to cognize what it is going to turn into. It just turns into a masterpiece because it's creative potentiality. So this idea of God as something that is cognizing, and so then we think, what a cruel God to have created me and put me in this situation. If one situation is, or looking at, some human or a lot of human lives include a lot of suffering. So they say we have an image of God having created this for others, instead of realizing that God as energy, potential energy, has turned into the whole of the manifestation. And it then starts pointing towards this, what is the purpose of life? And this question of purpose is a human question. From outside of time and space, from outside of knowing life as we know it, the question of purpose might be irrelevant. So an answer to the question of purpose that goes towards maybe putting forward a useful answer is to say, one, you could say there is no purpose in life. What it really means is there is no purpose as the psychological me imagines there needs to be a purpose, because the psychological me is looking for the end of suffering. It's looking for the end of this uncomfortableness, and it assumes that that's going to come with circumstance, with pleasure. It assumes that once it has meaning, once it has a passion, once it does what it is destined to be doing in life, that's when it will feel like it has purpose. And the imagination of the doer that is uncomfortableness and thinks its happiness is going to come through finding its purpose, essentially, when you look at it, is the sense that I will one day be comfortable when I am performing, when I am providing outcomes, when I am doing some ideal version of themselves, saving the world, creating, inventing, helping, fixing. And so that's the psychological me looking for purpose in outcomes. And the spiritual seeking knows that the spiritual seeker, the spiritual teacher, the spiritual teachings know that that is the purpose that the psychological me is looking for. And so when the psychological me says, what's the purpose of life? The teachings say, there is no purpose. Or it can say the purpose of life is to be. And to the psychological me, it's like, no, I am, and it's completely unsatisfying. I need to become. To be is not good. I want to become. And mind you, there is a theory of becoming, and it also makes sense because if we don't hold the paradox of things and we talk about being, another philosopher can say you can't talk about being because life is always becoming. Life is always change. Life is never static. And so if we understand what that philosopher means, where he says life is a philosophy of becoming, not being, they're not arguing with each other. They might if the philosopher is attached to, making one wrong and being right themselves. But if both philosophers understand, or mystics, or understand the paradox of life, the one that says it's about becoming will understand it's not about a psychological becoming in the future where I will one day be complete. He's talking about life being a movement of life that is always in flux, and therefore we can't say it is static, and so it's always becoming, meaning it's always moving, which is different to the psychological becoming. And so the being and the becoming, from one perspective, can be seen as the paradox. That there is this becoming, which is life always moving, and yet the essence of the moving life is always unchanging. So that is the paradox of the surface movement and the deep level. A bit like a pond that has ripples on the surface, and at its depth it's dead still, no current. So if we look at life from this appreciation of maybe it's not as it seems, maybe time and space are not as real as they appear on the surface, maybe form is not as real as it is, and yet when we start looking at life as spontaneous and as an arising in consciousness, let's not overlook how it presents on the surface. Because the truth is we can say, oh, it's not this way. That is ignorance, what we see on the surface. And maybe if we awaken to the other side, we then say, oh, this is truth. And this is what we used to see life as, is illusion. it's not that, it's that they both coexist. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater when we look at life as non-causal and spontaneous and not form but formless. Let's appreciate that, and let's be able to move from one platform to the other such that we can also see it simultaneously as both, which then means that we have to very clearly continue to live our life as if life is an objective reality, as if life is form. And when I say as if, it's not really pretending. It is form on the surface level. Pick a book up and hit yourself on the head with it, and you'll see that the book doesn't go through your head. It just creates a physical pain, maybe. So you can't go around saying the book is not real, because in practical terms, on a daily living point of view, it is. But if we then say, oh, you have to live as if it's real, and then you always see the book as only one way, it can be getting in the way of an appreciation of life and oneself in the depth that's available. And the good news is that seeing life from this non-causal, non-linear, non-form perspective, opening up to that, simply in its integrated form, further uproots the notion of personal doership and attachment to outcomes, and leads to, in practical terms, peace of mind in daily living, which, lest we forget, is what we're really looking for. To just know life as non-linear and formless and not time-bound, to awaken to that is of what purpose does it serve? Especially if it doesn't dissolve the suffering, then we might think that the purpose is to know that nature of life or life from that angle. And we might miss the fact that if the suffering is still arising, that we might have fixated on what the real awakening or the real liberation is from, what enlightenment really is about, and become fixated on continually reaffirming the non-reality of life, the non-causality of life, which can prevent us from integrating the two views, and which can prevent the deeply ingrained attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes from dissolving fully. So when you're walking in the park, wondering about the nature of time and space and form, be aware of the thoughts that are arising and understand that they are objects arising in the present moment. And you can see it both from a causal point of view or from a spontaneous arising point of view, which from the spontaneous arising point of view, there is awareness that is aware of the present moment, and the thoughts essentially pop out of nowhere and then subside. And be aware of those thoughts as outputs. And if there is a seeing that what we know ourselves as is essentially contained in the thinking, we can have quite a realization about who am I? Seeing that what I've always known myself as is the sense contained within a thought. And if it clicks, so if I'm not that, because clearly that is a thought which is an output, what am I? And the answer is self-evident. Maybe not while the thinking continues. your peace of mind, when it sets in, is self-evident, self-confirming. What does that mean? It means no one can certify your enlightenment. No one needs to certify your enlightenment. The doership aspect that is so convinced that happiness is to be found in outcomes, in pleasure, even when peace of mind has settled in largely, still wants others to confirm it, wants to tell others about it in an attempt to get confirmation. And we might see that at some point and go, oh, that's where I'm forgetting that peace of mind is self-evident, is self-confirming, meaning I won't get it from the others. It's already here, that recognition can bring a cutting off of what is still a remnant of the attachment to outcomes, the seeking confirmation even from a teacher or from society, from your friends. It's like, who cares? Can be the realization internally. Who cares? Because the peace is self-evident, self-confirming. It exists already. And it's just about us appreciating it for what it is, which is a causeless peace. When I say causeless, what I mean is not caused by the attaining of outcomes that we always assumed would be the cause of our happiness. So when it's referred to as the peace that surpasseth understanding, it's really talking about, or the causeless peace. It's talking about how this peace is not to be found from gaining anything. And so we wonder, why is this peace here when I haven't got anything? And the answer is that it's maybe not as causeless as that statement might sound. It's simply, we could say, the cause is or the reason is my essence. That my essence is devoid of this psychological me that is wanting and knowing itself a certain way that is inherently uncomfortable. So when the psychological me dissolves, the uncomfortableness dissolves. And then we find I never needed a solution through outcomes, and that outcomes were never going to be the solution, because the uncomfortableness of the seeker me would have persisted even when the outcomes were delivered. So let's see if there's a question. Hi, Holger.
I only can say hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. What about, you said suffering is attitudinal.
Mm-hmm.
Is the attitude in my control?
No. The attitude is contained in the psychological me, which is spat out by the body-mind instrument. And the body-mind instrument is spat out of life, let's say, and is conditioned by life. And so the attitude is also not in your control. It will change according to destiny. And in practical terms, that means if life delivers new conditioning, that changes the up-to-date conditioning. So your question is your functioning, which is life functioning. My answer is life functioning. And so that can be life's delivering new conditioning that changes life's up-to-date conditioning. So all there is...
The resistance to... What about the resistance to the flow of life?
That's not your doing either. That is the attitude. That is a happening.
So I only can surrender in a way which I cannot do.
That's right. Who? Who surrenders? Where is this me?
In the Bible, it says, "Let the weak say, I am strong."
Right.
What does this do in? I mean, who says I am strong? I mean, is this just a psychological entity puffing itself up, creating a new illusion, or is this just a stilling of the mind again, just a relaxing?
Yeah, I'm. To be honest, I'm not familiar with that that part. And you said, "Let the weak say they are strong."
Let the weak say, I am strong. Yes, that's a part in the Bible.
Say, let the weak say I am strong. That is God saying that about the weak. Let the weak say that God is strong.
No, I cannot tell you. I would need to look back into scripture. It's just a phrase that sticks in my head. It just says, let the weak say. Anyway, just I understand it that there is a connection between your I am, the way you identify, and the reflection in the world. How do you see the connection between attitude and circumstance? I mean, if you feel yourself as not worthy or a failure or something, then life just automatically reflects your attitude, isn't it?
Well, there can be, yes, you could say circumstance seems to be interconnected with one's attitude. But in each moment, if you look at it in the moment, there is the circumstance and then one's attitude to the circumstance. So you can wake up in the morning and feel unworthy for being alive. And so lying in bed is the circumstance, and the attitude is the feeling, the sense of not being worthy. And what can happen is they can feel like they are not two, that they are, where does one begin and one end, or where does one end and the other begin? And as more and more awareness comes in, it starts to become apparent that there is this layer of attitude, especially as that isn't there, and then it comes in. Then you can see, oh well, there's life, and either there is this cloud of unworthiness, and at other times it just lifts. And when it lifts, we say, oh look, I'm in the same circumstance more or less, and yet the uncomfortableness is not here. If one's uncomfortableness is very persistent, then it might be that the clarity of the difference between attitude and circumstance is not so clear. And what also seems to be the case is that even though it's not my doing, the change happens with a correlation to clarity. But clarity isn't my doing. So clarity happens, and when clarity happens, change follows. It seems like that's just part of the causal law of the story. So the good news is that the individual doesn't have to even worry about their attitude, because it's not their doing. So as you said,
I admire you.
It leaves just surrender left. And that surrender is a complete just, dropping of, it's where you have no space to do anything, because you've seen, even my attitude is not my doing. So the me can fizzle out if it becomes really seen. no one ever does anything.
Me and misery.
Yes.
I admire your mental capacity, and sometimes I feel I maybe, or let's say, I wonder about the muscle you speak about that atrophied in us. Does it have to do with thinking, with reiterating things, with getting clear, or can you speak more about this one muscle? Because it seems to be very weak in me.
I guess it's going to be different for everyone. That's why, for example, there are different yoga paths, spiritual seeking paths. So there is the path of bhakti, which is different to the path of jnana, which is different to the path of meditation, different to the path of karma yoga. And in one stream of bhakti yoga, it's simply giving yourself over to the guru or giving yourself over to those that need your assistance, selfless service. And that might be more applicable or more resonant for someone that doesn't feel inclined to think, to contemplate. There is just a surrender of the suffering in exchange for selfless service. So the guru says, just serve others. That's your life purpose. Your mission is to serve others, and lose yourself in serving others. Means you don't even have time to complain, because each time you go to complain, remember your mission is to serve others. And if you can't serve others, serve the guru. So that's one of the reasons I'm not a bhakti guru, because it's not my temperament. So there are these different paths for different seekers with different temperament. The meditation path tends to give much less instruction or concepts than the jnana path does. It's just meditate, and that's why it's known as the ant's way, as opposed to jnana yoga, which is the bird path. Now that sounds like, jnana yoga is better. I want the bird path, not the ant path. The ant path is much slower. But should someone pick the bird path instead of the ant path, they might be doing themselves a disservice, because the bird path might not be appropriate for them. So it's simply about appropriateness. I found that the contemplation and the thinking was a great tool, but only because I felt compelled to look at the experience rather than go around thinking in my head about some world I imagined in my head. The contemplation was always about the tree and about the genes. What does that mean, genes? Oh, that means how I grew automatically as a baby. So if I was thinking about it, I'd be looking at my fingers, my hand, and seeing the genes expressing themselves as a hand, and then so all the pointers brought about an investigation in the present moment. And so I wouldn't be so hard on yourself. The dropping of any self-doubt is a big step forward.
It's thinking.
Go ahead. Say again.
What is thinking? What is thinking? Is it just an echo of some sense impulses?
Well, you could say thinking is a consequence to being in life, because we have a brain, and the brain is stimulated by the external circumstance, and so thoughts will be created not by a creator me, but as a response to the brain and the body being exposed to a circumstance. And the question then is, what thoughts arise? And so for some people, their thinking is going to be less acute or less active than someone else's, simply because of the way they process, the way the brain pictures things or whatever. And then it's a matter of going into the thinking. We have the thinking mind, we have the working mind, we have the contemplating mind. And so what is thinking? The thinking mind, we would say, okay, that's the output of the psychological me, based on the conditioning of personal doership. And if life dissolves that conditioning of personal doership, then you can say the structure in the brain has changed somewhat. And I don't necessarily mean the physical structure, all the bits of the brain will be the same, but on a deep level, even learning a new word in language is going to change the neural structure so that that word then exists in the neural structure. So if life has removed the conditioning of personal doership, which is a deeply ingrained belief, we can say that the neural structure of the brain has changed somewhat on the neural pathway level. And then the output of shame, of blame, of pride no longer arises. So a change of that conditioning, the doership conditioning, doesn't change the conditioning that allows us to function on a biological level. So we will still be able to speak, we'll still be able to use a knife and fork and drive a car and run and walk. All of that is also conditioning. We'll be able to think in terms of mathematics and language, have communication. So that's a different type of thinking, obviously, to the thinking of the thinking mind. So I hope that answers your question.
Not really, but I thank you for it. And I talk to you another time. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Holger. And another way of looking at it is thoughts are just destiny unfolding, spontaneous objects that create a certain effect in the present moment. Hi, Frank.
Hey, Roger.
I've got you now.
I'm so glad we're on the topic of thoughts, because that's what I wanted to ask you about. You get me now? You can hear me? Okay. It's good that we're on this topic of thoughts, because this is what I was going to ask you about today. I keep getting stuck on this idea that people know what they're doing, and they okay, well, let me see if I can put this in a way, because my mind is somebody. I get an automatic thought about that person. It's not always nice. It's not always positive. And something comes in and says, oh, in a more neutral way, and or change it to a positive thought. So as a non-doer, that first thought that comes up, I know that I didn't create that thought. It just popped up. It's like I'm not going into the basement every morning to make my thoughts for the day. They pop up. However, like I said, if I walk into a room and I have a negative thought about someone, I change that to a positive thought. I say, no, I don't want to have that thought again. I want to have a more positive thought. And I feel like that's my conscience coming in, not consciousness, not consciousness, but conscience. Comes in and says, no, let's think something nice about that person, because they're, I believe they're my brother or whatever. We're all children of God, whatever I say to myself. So, and then when somebody does something to me, like let's say I had somebody try to do something very horrible to me at one point, and they knew and I complained about it, and they kept doing it. So at some point, the person is making a decision to have a thought, to not only have a thought, or maybe not have the thought, but to act on that thought. So can you explain that to me? Because I'm stuck on this. I have resentments towards some people. So these resentments, I know these resentments are coming out of this belief that I have that people are acting on their thoughts knowingly. So can you help me with this?
Yes, sure. You might want to go back and listen to the recording. Zoom did great things to your voice. It slowed you down and it sped you up. But I think you're on real time now. You could say that that's your conscience, but whose conscience? So really what it is it's conscience happening. If we use conscience a certain way, so you say, no, don't think that about them, because actually that's, my suffering, and if I hate them, I'm hating myself, I'm hating life. So, or something more simple, let's not hurt them, because that's not very moral. That thought can come up and it can change your thinking, it can change your action. And it is conscience, let's say. Let's call it conscience, which really just means a certain type of thought. But whose conscience? It's the conscience of a biologically and psychologically conditioned instrument that is a product of life. So who, this is, Ramesh used to sometimes says, who thinks that? And we keep saying, well, I think that. And he goes, who? Who? I, but who? Because you're saying I, thinking that the I is some psychological me, that that we have an idea of what I is. Whereas in the teaching, Roger or Ramesh or Frank is a biologically conditioned instrument, meaning just an instrument. This word biologically conditioned, it's just an instrument. And in each moment, the instrument is exactly the way life has produced it. And so what seems like your thought is life's thought. All right? That's what everything is happening according to God's will. Is you can everything is happening according to life. So the thought that says, don't think this, and then the changing of the thinking is destiny unfolding. Life was destined to create the thought, don't think this way, and life created the change, and life also created the idea of a me that says, isn't that my thought? And didn't I therefore change the way I was thinking and the way I acted, later on in the day? And the explanation is there is no me, there is just life happening, meaning life in the form of the instrument. The instrument has a thought which we call conscience that is exactly according to life, according to God's will. And the outcome, which is either that type of thinking falling away or it persists, and you know as well as anyone that the outcome is not in your control. You can have that thought of conscience, which is really the instrument having the thought, and then the action or the thinking doesn't change, it carries on.
Interesting. So everything is just making its appearance. And so are we basically just watching our lives play out? Like this morning, I realized when I had a thought to go, I don't have a certain schedule for my job, so I just decided I get a thought, okay, I should go in now. So I realized as that was going on that I wasn't thinking that, it just came up out of nowhere. So I just kind of followed the thought, but I still had to make that decision to follow that thought and go to work.
Who
that's
who
also,
made the decision? No,
good one. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Who made that decision? That's what drives me crazy sometimes. I feel like, because I've always wanted to have a sense of agency in my life, because when I was a kid, I didn't have any at all. I had parents that were very, very domineering. So I'm like, I want a sense of, of doership. I want to be able to say I'm doing this, and I have power and I have strength, and I can make my own decisions. But yet it's all just being played out. It's all just according to God's plan, as you say. This is a tough thing to well, I don't want to put adjectives to it, but it's a retraining of my whole idea of what life is.
Yeah, keep
and
in
that
mind,
sense of agency that I want so bad. So even that sense of agency, that's really just more programming that I can take on as feeling like I have more agency, right? More power, more say
right.
So in my own life.
Because we think that will give us control over outcomes. Because we psychologically reacted to the lack of control of outcomes when we were younger, in a way that, let's say, blamed the parents, maybe hated the parents, maybe felt shame for not, rebelling or whatever. And at some point we say, that's it, I'm going to be the doer. I'm going to be the one that controls my life, so that it's not like it was in the past. And the fact is, it was like that in the past because it was God's will. You didn't have agency then, and you'll never have agency. And this idea of agency is simply to try and escape our attachment to painful outcomes. So giving up agency, actually, if you just keep it in mind for when it resonates, won't take anything away from you. It won't take anything of benefit away from you, put it that way. Because you're just giving up an idea of agency that has never existed. And once we see that everything is a happening, it doesn't take away the fact that in experience, you have what we can call free will in the moment to do whatever you feel like doing. And that what we're calling free will in the moment, which is really a feeling of free will, is still God's will, but don't lose track of the sight that God's will manifests as what we are describing as the sense of your free will, which then means you can live as if you have free will, which is great, because you can say, well, no one's making me do anything. I do whatever I feel like. And deep down on an attitudinal level, you know that you have no free will, which really doesn't mean, so no one in life is controlling you. In life, you can relate to yourself as the one doing in each moment what you feel like doing, right? And you know that from your experience where you said, I had to make the decision to go to work. So that's the feeling of free will. And yet, I'm also simultaneously pointing out who makes the decision. And the fact that we see there is no who doesn't mean there is no free will on the surface. The seeing there is no who takes away the psychological doership. It doesn't take away the free will in practice. So life is actually fantastic. Do exactly what you think or feel like doing in the moment, understanding deep down that your free will is God's will, which now means you and God are not two. God's will expresses itself through your free will.
Roger, that second thought. So this morning when I had that thought, I want to go to work, and then I said to you earlier, I made the decision to follow that thought and go. And you said who. So is that the who, since there's no doer? What is that? What is that who? Is that just life, consciousness saying, who? There's no who, but there's a decision being made to go to work, to follow that thought to go to work.
Yeah, but what you're calling the decision is just another thought. So the first thought was, I could go to work now. And then the decision is, let me get it over and done with, or let's just say let me get it over and done with. And then following that, the third part, so you had two thoughts. I could go to work. Yeah, let's get it done for the day. And then the next thing is the movement of, getting your sunglasses and your keys and going out to the car. And all of those are movements of the biological entity. Two sets of thought, one being less decisive, just an idea coming in. The second one being decisive thought. And the third being thought in action, which is simply, the biological entity going towards the keys and then towards the car and unlocking the door and turning the ignition and driving the shift, which it, because of its conditioning, knows what to do. And so in all of that, we'll see, there is no psychological me there. So there's no who, there is just an instrument of life. And so like you said, this is where being lived comes from. So you used a different word earlier on. It says we're just, we're watching ourselves, being lived. So what is watching? What is aware? The body is the instrument, and the body thinks. The body turns the key of the car and picks up the sunglasses. That's the body. So what is witnessing life, living the body? And so that means you can find yourself dropping back to an aspect of the human being, which is the witnessing aspect. Witnessing the body functioning automatically.
That's exactly what I was just going to ask you, and I'm so glad you said that, because that's that was the missing piece in all of this. So that witnessing, but still, I can't say that that's me. That's just that's consciousness itself. It's not. There's no who. There's no me. It's just. So the part of me that's thinking it's watching everything going on, like me getting up, going to work, getting in the car, whatever. That part that's watching it, because it almost feels like it gives me a sense of almost like relaxation to know that this is just happening and I'm just watching it. Well, I just heard myself back. But anyway, so do you know what I'm saying here? I'm getting lost, but I am understanding what you're saying. I just want you to know that. And I'm really liking what I'm hearing.
The aspect that's watching is a layer of the human being that is not mechanical. So the mechanical layer of the human being is the thinking, the emotions, the feelings, the knowing how to start the car. So all of that happens in the flow of life is mechanical. And then there is, and that's an aspect of the human being, but it's the non-doing, it's the automatic functioning, and there's no place for a who controller in there, a who doer, and then very clearly there is another aspect, another layer of the human being, which is that which is aware of the mechanical movement of the human, and that aspect that is aware isn't the doer either. That is the witness. And the witnessing is not a doing. The witnessing is just the functioning of that layer of the human being, which really means like the fire doesn't do heat. The fire is heat, right? The heat and the fire are not two. So in order for heat to emanate from the fire doesn't need to do heat. It is heat. And the layer of the human being that is consciousness doesn't need to do witnessing. It is witnessing. As in, not it is doing witnessing, but it is the very act of witnessing, just like fire is the act of heat. So play with that next time it pops up. Be that which is aware, realizing that there is no one doing it. And there doesn't need to be anyone doing it, because awareness is aware.
I was going to ask just a quick question on this, but I feel like I'm really pushing it with you today. But does that witnessing have any agency at all? Can
No.
the witnessing say, hey, the stuff that's going on, I got to change something here. This is not good. No?
No.
Am I taking it back to tuition?
There's a feedback loop. When awareness of life is, which is always, even when we're completely lost in suffering, there's still awareness of whatever we're thinking about or whatever. So awareness is aware of the suffering, let's say, because it's felt. If you can feel the suffering, the hatred, let's say, towards the other person, then awareness is aware of that hatred. When awareness is aware of, let's say, a thought, then another thought can arise, because there's this feedback loop that as soon as the thought is recognized by awareness, it gets fed back in as new conditioning. And then another thought can arise that says, oh, don't think like that. And that thought that says, don't think like that, may cut off the previous thinking, or it may not. The important point is to see it's a sort of thought arises, awareness registers the thought, and essentially spits it back in as an input into the system as like new conditioning. And that's when the system then receives the thought as an object that a new thought can arise in relation to. So there really is no doing. It's all just happening.
Thank you, Raja, so much.
Pleasure. We'll take one more question, I think, for today. Hi, Hayat.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good morning. Yeah, okay.
Good morning, I can see you.
Thank you. Thank you for trying to explain every concept in such detailed manner. Thank you very much. I spoke with you about 4 days ago, which was about the objective reality.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, okay. I was supposed to get back to you next day, but something came up and I was not able to. Anyway, I have heard you saying that the whole experience arises within you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. I heard you saying that whole experience arises within you.
Mm-hmm.
How I want to tell you what I understood from that. Mm-hmm. And then you can tell me if I have understood it rightly or not.
Okay.
Like suppose I'm sitting in a room with 4 friends and some music is coming from another room and I hear it. The waves hit my eardrum, get processed in the brain, and the knowing happens in the consciousness. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, it happens within me. If my hearing apparatus is healthy and if I am conscious, mm-hmm. it is the experience is happening within me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the source of this is in another room. Do you mean the source is also within me?
Yes.
No, what I want to confirm, the experience is happening within me, which I can see. Mm-hmm. But the source from where it arises is in another room.
The other room is inside you.
Well, how I understand it, if I am identified with impersonal consciousness, mm-hmm. then everything is inside me. Mm-hmm. If I am identified with impersonal consciousness, then everything is within me. But if I am identified with personal consciousness, then how is it within me? It's coming from another room.
So if you were to turn around, let's say, and look, because I can see there's a door behind you, and you see the room that, and the, let's say the music is in the other room and you can see the radio. The room actually is an experience happening inside of your consciousness. And the radio is an object inside the room that is arising in your consciousness. And so then you realize, oh, the body is not the subject. Because the other room is not within the body, right? The other room, which you can see, is within the field of awareness. So if you are looking through a door to another room, you can see the other room is not outside of your awareness. And so in the same way, if you aren't seeing the other room, let's say you say, well, I can't see the other room. The radio is in a room that I can't see, but I can hear it. And I would say, well, in that case, there is no radio, there is no room, there is just sound arising inside of you. And the notion that the sound is coming from a radio in another room is just a concept. That may be true on one level, because that life is a paradox. So I'm not saying that there is absolutely no radio and no sound coming from a radio. But from one perspective, there is no radio. There is just the sound. And the sound is in your consciousness. So if you maintain the concept that the sound comes from a radio, if you maintain that concept as truth, which says you make that into an absolute concept that you are not willing to see as relative, then this won't make sense, because the concept that says the source is the radio and the radio is in another room will hold things outside of you, will force things to be outside of you. If that concept loosens up and we see maybe the radio is not the source of the sound, maybe that is just based on my interpretation of how life is on the surface, then the experience of what I am and what is inside and what is outside can shift.
More people sitting with me, and all of them are hearing it. So is it not happening in, they have similar experience as I have.
But
so
even then you can't confirm that they are hearing it. From this perspective, they are objects in your experience. You have the experience of those people, which means they are in your awareness. The sound is in your awareness, and those people are putting out words, which the words are also in your experience, saying, isn't this beautiful music? That doesn't prove that they are hearing it. Now, I'm not saying they're not, because, as I said, life is paradoxical. But we can't then say, I will only see it from the perspective that they are absolutely hearing it, and that is outside of my consciousness, and therefore that means there is an independent source outside of me. Because if we keep sticking to the way life is as we know it, we keep seeing life the way we've always seen it, which, as I was pointing at the beginning of this satsang, is maybe only one side of the coin. And the thing is, we've got a whole lifetime of seeing life this way. So having explanations that suggest otherwise can just seem unfathomable, and like there's no frame of reference for that. But if you stick with it, it might be interesting how the experience changes, and then it's not just a concept, and it will be like, oh, you might come on one day and say, oh, you know what? I realized everything's inside me. I think, are you muted?
I'm just kind of, I'm just trying to comprehend it, what you are saying.
You definitely got the first half. You've got the first half because you said, yes, the sound is inside my, my brain receives the sound, processes it, and then it appears in consciousness. So you can see that it appears in consciousness. Now I'm suggesting that what you know as the radio is already, so you're seeing the sound is processed by the brain. The visuals are the same. The visuals are processed by the brain like the sound. It's inside your consciousness. So with the visuals, you are assuming, well, the visuals you might also accept are within your consciousness. But your physical objects, also when you touch a physical object, like if you touch the radio, that sense of touch is no different to sound or visuals. They are senses processed by the brain arising in consciousness. So your concept of a radio that has an independent existence only exists because you've touched the radio before. And when you've touched the radio, you're not touching source, you're having an experience in your consciousness.
Experience happen only when one identifies with impersonal consciousness. If one is identified with personal consciousness, I feel that it's hard to experience what you are saying. But if one is identified with impersonal consciousness, then of course everything is happening within that, even this body, this mind, these thoughts, everything is happening within impersonal consciousness. So that's where I'm stuck. Mm-hmm. I really don't understand how is source within me if I feel like a personal consciousness.
So why can you stop identifying as personal consciousness?
Yes. And then everything is fine. Then I can understand everything, that everything is happening within me.
Right. So then we agree?
Yes. If I fall back into my personal consciousness, then it seems all separate. Mm-hmm. Only when I get into that state, that only when I feel that it's all impersonal and there is impersonal consciousness, mm-hmm. then yes, everything is happening within me.
Yeah, so when I describe that, I'm describing it from the perspective of impersonal consciousness.
Well, I agree with you. Yeah, then that makes it easy.
Yes, good.
That makes it quite understandable then. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.